One of the most desperate feats of the war was the attempt of Captain William H. Ward of Company B, 47th Ohio Volunteers, to run the gauntlet of the Confederate batteries at Vicksburg on the night of May 3rd, 1863. There were three barges loaded with stores for General Grant's army, but between them and their destination lay the enemy batteries, mounting more than 100 guns, many of them of the heaviest caliber. The Mississippi River makes a double bend at this point, like the letter S, and from the moment the barges entered the first bend till they emerged on the open river below, they would be under the concentration of the guns every foot of the way, and it seemed impossible that anyone could live under such a terrible fire. The strength of the position was not unknown for Captain Ward, for he had several times, from a distance, watched the batteries in action. When the ironclads were attempting to run the blockade, what he had seen, instead of deterring him, only made him more anxious for a closer acquaintance, and when a call was made for volunteers to take the barge down the stream, he was the first to offer himself. There was no lack of volunteers, and where only 35 men were required, 10 times that number were willing and anxious to go. One man, Addison J. Hodges, was so eager to go that he actually offered a comrade $1 to let him go in his place. Previous expeditions had run the gauntlet of these batteries with more or less success, but always on the darkest of nights and convoyed by armor-clad gunboats. On this occasion, a full moon and a clear sky made night as light as day, and there were no gunboats to shelter the barges from the enemy's fire. There was only one little tug, the George Sturgis, to tow the barges, and any accident to her would wreck the whole expedition. This did not discourage the gallant little band, and the account of the adventure is entertainingly given by Captain Ward, as follows. We cast off from Milliken's Bend, about 15 miles above Vicksburg, at 10 o'clock p.m. The trip down the river was uneventful until 2 o'clock in the morning, when a rocket sent up from one of the Confederate batteries warned the enemy of our approach, and we were soon under a heavy fire. It was a wild ride we had from this time on. Battery after battery opened on us as we came within range, until it seemed that the guns were being played upon like the keys of a piano. And to say that the rain of shot and shell was terrific but faintly describes the situation. The scene was indescribably grand and awe-inspiring as we steamed slowly past the city amid the roar of more than 100 guns, with their death-dealing missiles whistling and shrieking over and around us and exploding on board, while the patter of bullets from the infantry resembled a fall of hailstones. The barges were large and unwieldy, and as we could make only about 6 miles an hour at best, the enemy's gunners were able to get our range accurately. We had been struck many times but not seriously damaged. The little tug seemed to bear a charmed life, for we passed several times within 100 yards of the heaviest batteries. We now had been under fire 3/4 of an hour, and had reached a point below the city where 10 minutes more meant safety. The steady puff-puff of the little tug gave assurance that all was right, and we were beginning to indulge in the mental congratulation on the success of the expedition, when a roar like a bursting of a volcano caused the barges to rock as if shaken by an earthquake. In an instant the air was filled with burning coals, flying timbers, and debris. A plunging shot from a heavy gun, stationed on an eminence far in the rear, had struck the tug and penetrated to the furnaces, where it exploded, blowing the boilers and the machinery up through the deck, and completely wrecking the vessel. The burning coals fell in a shower over both barges, setting fire to the bales of hay in hundreds of places at once. The enemy sent up a cheer upon witnessing our misfortune, and for a few minutes seemingly redoubled their fire. The tug went down like a plummet, while the barges were soon blazing wrecks, drifting with the ebbing current of the river. No recourse remained but surrender, and the waving of a handkerchief from a soldier's bayonet caused the firing to cease. The flames compelled the survivors to seek safety by taking to the water, and, having no boats, we floated off on bales of hay, and found them surprisingly buoyant. The wounded were first cared for, and then ale took passage on the hay bale line. The enemy now hailed us from shore, ordering us to come in and surrender, but, on learning that we had no boats, sent their own to our assistance, capturing all but one of our survivors. That one, Julius C. Conklin by name, was the only man in the party who could not swim. He managed, with the aid of a piece of wreckage, to reach the Louisiana shore unobserved by the enemy, and rejoining his company 2 days later. When all had been rescued and assembled in the moonlight under guard of Confederate bayonets, the roll was called, and just 16, less than half our original number, were found to have survived. Some of the scald men were piteous sights to behold, the flesh hanging in shards from their faces and bodies, as they ran about in excruciating agony, praying that something be done to relieve their suffering. These, with the wounded, were speedily sent to the hospital, where some of them died the next day. It is not often, even in a soldier's life, that one is compelled to face death in so many forms as beset our little party on that memorable night. Shot and shell, fire, water, and a boiler explosion with its intended horrors. Our captors treated us with marked consideration, affording every courtesy consistent with the rules of war, and we were the recipients of many attentions from soldiers and citizens who seemed to marvel at the temerity of our undertaking. We were held prisoners in Vicksburg for 2 days, when General Grant, having crossed the river and defeated the enemy near Grand Gulf, Mississippi, began to threaten the city from the rear. We were then paroled and hurriedly forwarded to Richmond, Virginia, where, after an eventful journey through the Confederacy, we dutifully arrived and were assigned quarters in that famous Confederate hostelry, Libby Prison. Here, we remained about 6 weeks before we were exchanged, and we were only able to rejoin the regiment in the trenches before Vicksburg, on the evening before the surrender, just in time to be in at the death. Language fails to describe my feelings when, with a few companions, I entered the city the next morning, July 4th, immediately after the surrender, under circumstances in such marked contrast with my forced advent of a few weeks before. Now, no hostile demonstration of any kind greeted us. The great guns were still, the hostile flags were furled, and Old Glory floated proudly from the public buildings, while our late foes were waiting resting in their camp, awaiting the pleasure of the victors.